The desert wind howled like a blast furnace, tearing past the canopy of the P-47 Thunderbolt as Lieutenant Richard Hunziker locked his gloved fingers around the control stick. He was just 19. Sweat and desert grit clung to his face beneath the leather of his flight helmet. His pulse drummed in his ears, louder than the engine's roar. Below him, the earth of central Tunisia shimmered in endless ripples of gold and dust, broken only by the glint of steel. Dozens of German tanks, dark and deliberate, crawled across the sand toward a narrow ravine where more than 800 American infantrymen were pinned down, trapped, and waiting for help that wasn't coming. From his headset came the clipped, urgent voice of command. "Abort. Return to base immediately. You are not cleared to engage." Hunziker barely heard it. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the desert below. Under his breath, almost like a prayer, he muttered, "I'm not letting them die." He pushed the stick forward. The Thunderbolt's nose dipped. The horizon spun, and the sky turned into a whirl of sunlight and smoke. Anti-aircraft bursts clawed upward like black petals in the wind. He dove straight into them. At 19, Lieutenant Richard Overton Hunziker was the youngest pilot in his squadron, a farm boy from Missouri who had never seen the ocean before shipping out, never flown over a real battlefield, never fired his guns in anger. His father was a mechanic, his mother a teacher. He wasn't raised on glory, only on hard work, decency, and a sense of duty. When he enlisted at 18, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, he still had the look of someone who didn't yet believe war could be real. Flight school had been fast, merciless, not because he was the best, but because the air war in North Africa was devouring pilots faster than they could be trained. Dive bombers especially faced dreadful odds. 1 in 3 never came home. And yet, Hunziker had volunteered for it. When he first walked into the squadron tent in Tunisia, the older pilots barely looked up. One of them smirked and called out, "Hey, farm boy, you sure this isn't a delivery route?" They didn't mean harm, they just didn't expect him to last. At first, he flew reconnaissance runs, high, safe, away from the worst of it. He kept formation, followed orders, spoke little. But inside, something restless stirred. At night, he'd lie awake on his cot, listening to the low thud of artillery echoing across the dunes, wondering what it was like to be down there, trapped, afraid, praying for someone to show up in the sky. He began volunteering for riskier assignments, offering to lead, to dive, to do more than observe. His commanding officer, a man carved by exhaustion and smoke, would shake his head. "Not yet, Hunziker. You're too green." But Hunziker would simply reply, "Sir, I didn't come this far to just circle the sky." April 3rd, 1943. That was the day everything changed. The day a 19-year-old lieutenant, with less than 100 hours of combat flight, faced a decision that would define his life and the lives of hundreds below him. That morning, the sun rose like a blade over Tunisia. The ground was dry, cracked, shimmering with heat. The American 45th Infantry Regiment had orders to advance through a narrow wadi west of Maknessi. A routine sweep, command had called it. Light resistance, link up by sundown. But nothing in war is routine. Unbeknownst to Allied intelligence, German scouts from the Afrika Korps had spotted the movement. Before dawn, 3 companies of Panzer IVs and mobile artillery had already crept through the surrounding hills, sealing the valley like a closing fist. By noon, the trap was sprung. The 45th was surrounded, pinned in the open, forward movement cut off by tank fire, the rear blocked by shell-torn terrain. Radios sputtered with half-sentences, broken signals, static. Men shouted into microphones no one could hear. And up in the sky, Lieutenant Hunziker's Thunderbolt was just beginning its recon flight, high above Route 12, 5 planes in formation. Orders were clear: observe, do not engage. But Hunziker saw something the others didn't. On the valley floor, trails of smoke rose like veins of ink. Tanks were on the move. Too many, too coordinated, too close. He toggled his radio, switching to an open frequency. The sound that came through wasn't static. It was chaos. "We're pinned. Need air support. Anyone, do you read? They're coming from the North Ridge. For God's sake, where's our cover?" Hunziker froze. He knew that voice. It was Private Earl McKinley, a soft-spoken kid from Alabama who'd once shared coffee with him during a weather delay. He had shown Hunziker a photo of his newborn daughter, smiling in the sunlight. That same voice now cracked with fear and desperation. The squadron leader's voice cut in sharply. "All units, pull west. Repeat, do not engage. Return to base." One by one, the planes began banking away, silver dots disappearing into the haze. Hunziker didn't move. His hands hovered over the controls. He looked down again, saw the tanks tightening the noose, saw flashes of gunfire licking at the valley. He keyed his mic. "Command, this is Lieutenant Hunziker, requesting immediate strike authorization. I have a clear visual on enemy armor engaging friendly infantry. Static. Then, negative Hunziker, return to base. Do not engage." Another voice broke through. McKinley again, pleading, "They're killing us down here. Where's our air cover?" Hunziker glanced at his gauges. Fuel, half a tank. 2 1,000-pound bombs under his wings, enough for one run, if he got lucky. He looked to his left. His wingman, Lieutenant Connors, was still in formation. Hunziker's voice cracked through the headset. "Connors, I'm going in." "What? You heard the order. That's suicide." No answer. The Thunderbolt peeled away, diving headlong toward the desert floor. The wind screamed. The sky blurred. Black bursts erupted around him, flak shells like iron blossoms. His canopy rattled. At 5,000 feet, he opened his dive brakes. At 3,000, he aligned the sight. The tanks were clustered at the mouth of the ravine, waiting for the final strike. At 1,500 feet, he armed the bombs. His heartbeat slowed. The noise fell away. In that sliver of silence, Hunziker whispered one name: Earl. At 900 feet, he released. The Thunderbolt lurched upward, G-forces crushing him into the seat. 2 black shadows fell away beneath him. He didn't look back, just climbed into the pale desert sky as the earth below bloomed in dust and light. And somewhere, amid the static, a faint voice rose again, hoarse, disbelieving, alive. "We see you. We see you up there." The desert went quiet again. The war, for one impossible heartbeat, seemed to hold its breath. The ground rushed toward him like a wall of fire and dust. Then came a flash, a soundless eruption that seemed to tear the air apart behind him. The P-47 Thunderbolt jolted upward, shuddering as though the sky itself resisted his climb. For a few long heartbeats, there was no sound but the roar of the engine fighting for its life. Lieutenant Richard Hunziker didn't look back. He didn't have to. The men on the ground would remember what they saw for the rest of their days: a single American dive bomber plunging alone into a storm of German guns, carving a streak of light through the smoke and striking the lead tank head-on. For the soldiers of the 45th Infantry below, it looked like madness or a miracle. In that narrow Tunisian ravine, where death had felt certain only seconds earlier, the impossible had just happened. The tanks that had trapped them were gone. Where once had been the rhythmic thunder of Panzer treads, there was now silence and smoke curling upward in ghostly ribbons. For a moment, no one spoke. The infantrymen just stared at the sky, unsure if they had truly seen it. A single aircraft descending from nowhere, slicing through chaos like judgment from the heavens. But in the cockpit, there was nothing divine. Hunziker was fighting for control. The explosion had ripped through the airflow, and his left wing flaps were torn and flailing. The cockpit rattled like a loose engine casing. Warning lights flared red across the panel. The air smelled of scorched metal and leaking oil. Every vibration screamed that the Thunderbolt was living on borrowed time. He gritted his teeth, steadied his grip, and coaxed the stick back with slow, deliberate force. 200 feet above the desert floor, the plane leveled just enough to climb. Below him, he could see the faces of the infantrymen as he passed overhead, young, dirty, wide-eyed, and alive. He coughed through the smoke curling around the edges of his mask. As he gained altitude, the scale of what had happened came into focus. The German formation had fractured. A handful of tanks were still trying to maneuver, but the geography of the ravine, so perfect for the ambush, had become their trap. The lead vehicles were burning wrecks, the ones behind bottlenecked and immobile. German infantry scattered for cover, expecting more aircraft to descend out of the sun. But there were no others. There was only Richard. Back at base, the radio room was chaos. His squadron had returned and reported Lieutenant Hunziker as missing, possibly shot down. The commanding officer paced, jaw tight, face pale with anger. Unauthorized engagement, violation of direct order, possible loss of aircraft and pilot. Then came the impossible crackle of a transmission from the 45th Infantry's forward observer. Whoever hit that panzer column, tell them we're still holding. The enemy's advance has stopped. Another voice cut in, weary but elated. We saw it. One bird, one dive. Took out their lead tanks. Saved us all. I don't know who he was, but every man here owes him his life. Out over the desert, Hunziker steadied his trembling hands on the controls. His fuel gauge hovered near empty, oil pressure low, altimeter climbing by inches. The P-47 was a tough bird, the Jug, they called it, built like a flying anvil. But even a Jug could only take so much punishment. He flew low, hugging the curves of the terrain, coaxing every ounce of life from the damaged engine. Each sputter was a countdown. Each shudder felt like a plea. Come on, girl, he muttered through the mask. Just a little farther. Don't quit on me now. The airfield appeared at last, a pale scar against the red sand. Relief hit him like a wave, tempered by dread. He knew what waited on the ground, not celebration, but consequence. Disobedience carried weight, heavier than steel. Still, he lined up for approach. The wheels hit the runway hard, once, twice. The Thunderbolt bounced, skidded, and came to rest in a screech of tortured metal and dust. Ground crews raced out with extinguishers, dousing the smoking engine. Hunziker climbed down, legs shaking, flight suits streaked with oil. The commanding officer stormed across the tarmac, fury written in every stride. What the hell were you thinking? He shouted. You disobeyed orders. You broke formation. You risked your aircraft in the mission. Richard said nothing. The officer's voice rose. You could have been killed. Still nothing. The silence hung heavy until a young corporal ran up, clutching a field radio. Sir, urgent report from infantry command. The officer turned, impatient. What is it? The corporal swallowed hard. They're saying Lieutenant Hunziker saved the 45th. The airfield fell quiet. The tanks are down, sir. The Germans are retreating from the ravine. Command says that strike changed everything. The officer said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, he dismissed the corporal. He looked at Hunziker, studying him like a man trying to reconcile two impossible truths, the order broken and the lives saved. Finally, he turned away without another word. That night, Richard sat outside the hangar, the desert cold settling over the airfield. The adrenaline was gone now. His hands still trembled. His ears still rang with the memory of wind and flak. He sipped from a dented canteen, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. No glory, no cheering crowd, just exhaustion, and the faint realization that something inside him had shifted. Not just for the men he'd saved, but for himself. He wasn't the rookie anymore. He was the man who had done the unthinkable and survived. Morning came, and the base was buzzing. Whispers traveled faster than radio. Some said he was finished. Disobeying a direct order was a serious offense, one that could ground a pilot for good. Others said he had done what no one else had dared. A few even admitted in quiet corners of the mess hall that they wished they'd followed him. Hunziker ate alone, silent as always, his food untouched. The hangar door stood open to the morning sun, revealing the blackened nose of his aircraft. Mechanics were already at work, patching holes, wiping soot from its frame. The P-47 had lived to fly again. So had he. That afternoon, an official report arrived, typed neatly, its tone cold, clinical, almost indifferent. At approximately 1400 hours, April 3, 1943, one enemy armor column of no fewer than 11 Panzer IV tanks and accompanying infantry was halted in its assault, following a precision airstrike conducted by an unidentified American aircraft. As a result, more than 200 U.S. infantrymen were able to retreat to defensible ground. Reinforcements arrived within the hour. Estimated lives saved, 400 to 600. No name was listed, just an unidentified American aircraft. But everyone on the base already knew who it was. That evening, in the mess hall, men rose quietly when Hunziker entered. No applause, no ceremony, just nods, silent acknowledgments from soldiers who understood what it meant to act when orders said, "Stand down." He sat with his tray, staring at his food, not hungry, not proud, just grateful that the names on the casualty lists would be fewer. Later that night, a runner came for him. "Command wants to see you, sir." In the dim light of the tent, his commanding officer stood behind a wooden desk, papers spread like battle plans. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then the officer said, "You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir." "You risked your life, your plane, and the mission itself." "Yes, sir." The officer exhaled. "And in doing so, you saved a regiment." Richard didn't answer. The officer's tone softened. "This war doesn't need heroes, Lieutenant. It needs discipline. Men who follow orders even when it hurts." "I understand, sir." "But sometimes," the officer continued quietly, "it needs something else. Men who see what others can't, who act when no one else will. And sometimes, God help us, it needs men who break the rules, to save lives." He reached across the desk, holding out a folded document. "Effective immediately, you are being recommended for the Silver Star." Richard blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "You're also grounded for a week," the officer added. Hunziker managed the smallest smile. "Understood, sir." The officer nodded once. "Good." Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "You did the right thing, Lieutenant, even when it was the wrong way to do it." When Hunziker stepped outside, the desert was silent again. The wind had eased, and the stars were sharp above the hangar roofs. Somewhere out there, men were still fighting, still calling for help, still waiting for someone to answer. He looked down at his hands, still trembling, still alive, and for the first time, allowed himself to breathe. The night was cool, and the horizon glowed faintly with distant fire. The world, for the moment, was still. And above it all, the sound of a single engine echoed in memory, steady, defiant, and free. "Now, go get some rest, Lieutenant. We'll need you back in the air soon." The words were simple, but they carried a weight Richard Hunziker could feel deep in his bones. The desert wind whispered through the hangar as the last traces of sunlight faded over Tunisia. Word had already spread, faster than radio, faster than rumor. The rookie everyone had once dismissed as too quiet, too soft, too green, was now the pilot who had defied protocol and saved an entire regiment. Men spoke his name with quiet respect. He didn't speak of it himself. When asked, he would only say softly, "I saw what was happening. Someone had to do something." But the truth ran deeper than that. Richard hadn't acted out of impulse or recklessness. He had acted out of conviction, the kind that comes when duty collides with conscience. He knew the odds. He'd measured the risk, felt it in his chest, counted every second that might have been his last. And still, he went in. In the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted among the men of the 45th Squadron. Pilots began flying lower, braver. They pushed a little further into the storm before pulling back. Not because they were ordered to, but because they had seen what was possible when one man trusted his gut over the book. Command noticed it too. Orders stayed strict, at least on paper, but whispers began to change. "Use your judgment," became the quiet phrase passed between officers and trusted pilots. A small thing, but in war, small things could mean survival. Richard flew 32 more missions over North Africa after that. He never broke formation again. Not because he was afraid, but because he no longer needed to. His squadron followed him willingly. When he gave a command, they listened. Because the farm boy from Kansas had already proven what mattered. He had stared into the face of death and flown straight toward it, not for glory, not for medals, but for the men trapped on the ground, for the voices crying through static on the radio, believing no one would come. Behind closed doors, not everyone agreed. Some in the brass called him lucky. If those bombs had missed, one colonel said, the 45th would have been slaughtered. Discipline exists for a reason. And yet, others countered quietly that sometimes discipline alone wasn't enough. That in war, hesitation could kill more surely than a bullet. That sometimes it was better to act and be punished than to wait and be too late. The men who had survived that day didn't care about the debate. They didn't care about the chain of command, or about the proper wording of orders. All they remembered was the sound of that single engine screaming through the sky, the flash of light, the sudden silence after chaos, and the knowledge that somewhere up there, someone had chosen to risk everything for them. Years later, one of those soldiers, his hands trembling with age, was asked about the day he almost died in Tunisia. He looked off into the distance, eyes clouded with memory, and said quietly, "We thought we were dead. Then out of nowhere, this plane comes down like an angel falling out of heaven. One man, one plane, changed everything." He paused for a long while before adding, "That's how legends are born." Not in the halls of power, not in the ink of after-action reports, but in the hearts of men who lived because someone refused to let go. The story of Richard Hunziker's dive spread far beyond his unit. It rippled outward through the United States Army Air Forces, crossing continents and squadrons. Some spoke of it with admiration, others with unease, but everyone heard it. It sparked an old argument with no easy answer. What matters more in war, obedience or instinct? In April of 1943, American doctrine leaned hard toward obedience. Orders were sacred. You followed them, even when you didn't understand them. Because discipline kept armies alive. Because chaos killed. And yet, war itself was chaos. It shifted faster than command could adapt. Radios failed. Maps changed. Men made choices in seconds that shaped the lives of hundreds. From the foxholes of Italy to the skies above Tunisia, soldiers and pilots alike faced moments no field manual had prepared them for. Hunziker's dive forced that tension into the open. On paper, what he did was wrong. In the air that day, it was right. When command reviewed the mission, opinions split sharply. The official Silver Star recommendation described his actions as extraordinary valor under extreme conditions, and credited his attack with halting a major enemy advance. But buried in the fine print were 6 quiet words, despite deviation from standard air engagement protocol. That phrase was deliberate, a line drawn in ink to remind others that this was an exception, not permission. But the pilots in the barracks didn't see it that way. Around campfires and folding tables, in the cramped tents that smelled of fuel and dust, Hunziker's name came up again and again. Not as gossip, not as hero worship, but as a story that meant something. He wasn't one of the cowboys who showed off, who broke rules for attention. He had done it because no one else could, because someone had to. Captain Lawrence Hawk Hawthorne, a veteran known for his blunt honesty, said it best one night over black coffee. "Every war's got its showboats, guys who fly hot and end up in pieces. Hunziker wasn't one of them. He knew exactly what he was doing. He went in anyway, not for himself, for them. The kind of dive Hunziker made that day was considered one of the riskiest maneuvers in the Air Corps. Solo dive bombing missions were high risk, low reward. The margin for error was measured in seconds. The angle of approach, airspeed, wind resistance, all had to align perfectly. At too steep a descent, the plane would never pull out in time. Too shallow, and the bombs would miss. Most training manuals called it suicidal without escort or air cover. Yet, when it worked, it could turn the tide of a battle. By 1943, dive bombing had become an art as much as a tactic. The Douglas SBD Dauntless had shown its worth in the Pacific, and now the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy, armored, unyielding, was carrying that legacy into Europe and North Africa. The Jug, as it was affectionately called, could take hits that would have shredded a lighter fighter. But even the Jug had limits, and no aircraft, no matter how tough, could protect a pilot from the choices he had to make in a split second. In the months after Tunisia, a quiet transformation took place. Not in policy, no memo would ever bear his name, but in attitude. Orders began to include phrases like, "use your best judgment," or "respond based on conditions in the field." Small adjustments, subtle acknowledgments that the battlefield often outpaced the rulebook. They were, in their own way, a salute to men like Hunziker. His example became something between myth and doctrine, a whisper that courage, properly guided, could coexist with discipline. Other pilots started to take initiative, not out of recklessness, but out of trust. They planned better, trained harder, studied terrain and wind. They wanted to be ready for that one moment when instinct might save lives. And sometimes it did. In Italy, a young pilot broke formation to destroy an unlisted bridge, later discovered to be the Wehrmacht's main supply route. In France, a bomber crew deviated from orders to avoid a Luftwaffe ambush and accidentally uncovered an armored convoy, crippling it before it reached Allied lines. None of these actions were officially credited to Hunziker, but the men behind them all knew his story. Even decades later, when the war had long ended, when the deserts of North Africa and the skies over Europe existed only in grainy photographs and fading memories, his name still surfaced in veterans' halls and letters exchanged between old friends. It wasn't spoken loudly. It didn't need to be. It was a name tied to something rare, not rebellion, not blind obedience, but the space between them. The point where courage bends the rules just enough to do what's right. When asked about it years later, by then an old man with silver hair and hands that trembled more from age than fear, Richard Hunziker only smiled faintly. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just did what anyone would have done, if they'd heard what I heard that day." Outside, the sun was setting again, the same way it had over Tunisia all those years ago, painting the horizon in fire and dust. The world had changed, but the memory of that one dive still lingered, quiet and unassuming. A single act of courage echoing through time, like the hum of an engine fading slowly into the desert night. "I just saw men in trouble," Richard Hunziker once said softly, "and I was the only one up there who could do something about it." He never raised his voice when he said it. No theatrics, no proud grin. Just calm conviction, the kind that leaves no space for ego. And maybe that was his last and greatest lesson. Courage, he believed, wasn't about glory or headlines, or the promise of being remembered. It was about doing the right thing, especially when it cost you something, especially when no one else would. In that quiet, unshakable way, Richard Hunziker became more than just a pilot. He became a mirror, held up to every soldier, every airman, every human being who has ever faced that moment of impossible choice. Follow the order, or follow your gut. Risk punishment, or risk letting others die. There's no easy answer to that question. There never has been. But Hunziker gave us one possibility. Sometimes, in the middle of the worst kind of war, the best kind of man makes the hardest kind of decision and lives with it. not as a hero, but as a man who chose right when it mattered most. For the soldiers on the ground that day in Tunisia, everything after the explosion blurred into disbelief. One moment, they were bracing for the end. The next, the horizon erupted in fire, and the weight pressing down on them. The dread, the certainty of death, suddenly lifted. What they saw above was a streak of silver, a single P-47, plunging like a falling star, vanishing in smoke and thunder. Then silence, a silence so deep it felt sacred. The lead Panzer vanished. Another lay on its side, tread spinning aimlessly in the sand. The column halted. Confusion rippled through the German line. And for the men of the 45th Infantry, that silence was life itself. It gave them seconds to breathe, minutes to move, hours to survive. Private Earl McKinley, the same trembling voice Richard had heard through static, remembered crawling from behind a shattered boulder, still clutching his rifle, whispering to no one in particular, "Did God just drop that bomb?" For days afterward, the men argued about what had happened. Some thought it was an accident, others said it was divine. But the engineers later confirmed the truth. The lead tank had been carrying a mobile command post, maps, radios, the German company commander himself. When that vehicle was destroyed, the rest of the column was blinded. They didn't know where to turn. In those few crucial minutes of chaos, American reinforcements broke through. That single dive, one pilot, one choice, had changed the course of the entire engagement. Years later, in Colorado Springs, old men with fading service ribbons and trembling hands gathered around a fire at a reunion. The desert dust had long since turned to snow, but the memory of that day burned clear as ever. "He came out of nowhere," one of them said, staring into the flames. "Just one of ours, diving like he wanted to kiss the ground. Then, boom, it was like the sky answered us." Another added, "We used to joke that if I ever met that pilot, I'd buy him a drink, maybe two." And in time, some of them did. In 1961, nearly 20 years after the war, a letter found its way to Oregon. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. It came from a man named Harold Miles, once a radio technician with the 45th Infantry. He'd spent years searching service records, old rosters, veteran directories, until he found the name Richard Hunziker. The letter began simply, "You saved my life. I don't know if you even remember what you did, but I do. My kids do. Every year on April 3rd, I tell them the story of the man in the sky who gave me a second chance." Richard wrote back, modest as ever. "I'm glad you made it home," he said. No mention of medals, no talk of the Silver Star, just a line at the bottom. "All the best, Richard." More letters followed over the years, from soldiers, from mechanics, from medics who had been in that valley. Some called him their guardian angel. Others simply wrote, "We saw you. We never forgot." Many of those men went on to build lives that might never have been. One became a school principal, another a small-town congressman. A few built businesses. Earl McKinley, the young soldier whose voice had crackled through Richard's headset that day, became a chaplain for returning Vietnam veterans. When asked why, he'd say, "Because once, someone didn't leave us behind." As for Richard, he never sought fame or parades. After the war, he met a nurse in England, married her, and settled in Oregon. He became a flight instructor, teaching hundreds of young pilots how to trust their machines, how to read the air and quietly, how to trust themselves. He rarely spoke about Tunisia, not to his students, not to the reporters who occasionally found their way to his doorstep. When asked what made a good pilot, he'd smile and say, "Someone who knows when to pull the trigger and when not to." Those who knew him best, his wife, his children, his fellow instructors, understood what that really meant. Richard wasn't just teaching men to fly, he was teaching them how to decide. Because in April of 1943, when everything screamed for him to turn back, when every rule said don't, he had chosen to go anyway. That decision had rippled outward, through decades, through generations. And maybe that's the truest measure of a legacy, not how loudly it's remembered, but how deeply it's felt. Richard Hunziker passed away quietly in the summer of 2007. He was 83. The obituary in the Oregon Journal was brief, just a few lines. World War II veteran, flight instructor, loved fishing, family, and the open sky. It didn't mention Tunisia. It didn't need to. The men who knew the truth already carried it with them. At his funeral, beneath a soft Oregon rain, an elderly man stood by the grave, holding a folded flag to his chest. It was Harold Miles, the same technician who'd written that first letter more than 40 years earlier. He bent down and placed an envelope on the casket. On the outside, written in careful block letters, were 5 words: April 3rd, 1943. Thank you. Inside was a single page, yellowed with age. It was a copy of a message Hunziker had once sent to his father, long ago, recovered from a military archive. If I don't make it, tell Dad I'd rather die doing the right thing than live doing nothing. It wasn't polished, it wasn't poetic, but it was honest. And that honesty carried the weight of every soldier who's ever stood at the crossroads of duty and choice. That sentence, written by a 19-year-old boy in a dusty tent in North Africa, became his final testament. Because the truth is, wars aren't made of victories or speeches. They're built from moments, small, sharp decisions that happen in seconds, when there's no time to think, only to feel. A pilot hears a voice over static. A soldier steps forward when everyone else hesitates. A man dives into fire, knowing it may be the last thing he ever does. Most of those moments are forgotten, but not this one. This one left a mark, not on a map or a medal, but in the lives of those who came home because one man chose to act. Richard Hunziker didn't die in battle, but he risked everything for those who might have, and that risk became his legacy. Not the kind you carve into stone, but the kind that lingers in the silence after the guns have stopped. The kind carried in the hearts of men who once looked up and saw his shadow cutting across the sun. When all hope was gone, in that single dive, he became more than a pilot. He became a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to fly anyway. That rules matter, but so does the moment. And that sometimes, in the fog of war, the clearest vision belongs to the one who dares to see past orders and follow his conscience. So, if you remember nothing else about this story, remember this. A 19-year-old from Kansas, alone in the sky, ordered to turn back, chose instead to dive toward danger. Not for glory, not for medals, but because it was the right thing to do. And hundreds of men lived because he did. And somewhere, even now, if you listen closely enough, you might still hear it, the echo of an engine fading into the desert wind. What shocked you most? The dive, the disobedience, or the aftermath? Tell us in the comments below.